Back in 2023, we were taking a look on this channel at what was happening with Pokemon and Pokemon Bank, and we were talking about how, inevitably, Bank would likely be shut down, which would terminate official tools for people to be able to move their Pokemon that they earned, that they caught in these older games, between some of those games and even into the future. And cut ahead to now in 2026, that's what's happening. Pokemon Bank is scheduled to be shut down on February 25th of 2027. If you're watching this before that, I want to explain why this actually matters to people, why it's not just a bunch of old people crying about old software. This is something that is legitimate, and if you're watching it after, I want to explain what was actually lost when Nintendo did this. This breaks a huge transfer chain that allowed people to carry Pokemon back from decades of games. And we knew that Bank couldn't stay online forever because that's the problem. That is the problem with the all-digital future and the always-online future of relying on companies and their goodwill to keep these things operational. It just is not going to happen forever because anywhere they see red on a spreadsheet and they lose money, they're going to cut costs. You know, this is why I was warning people about this back then, and why I was taking it seriously, because right now, when recording this, there's no replacement for that officially. I do want to know if you have Pokemon that you've carried across multiple games, if that's something that matters to you. Do you like transferring them? But let me know, because this is something that frustrates me a lot, and I do want to know if you have a Pokemon you've been carrying with you over the years, what it is. I want to keep this simple without getting too bogged down in the details, but I will explain some of them throughout the video. Essentially, when this happens, Pokemon Bank no longer functions at all, according to the official data. Bank will no longer be usable to transfer Pokemon between 3DS games, essentially, so you can't just do that easily. Pokemon can no longer be moved from Bank into Pokemon Home. Transporter's path essentially into Bank will be gone. If you're someone who's just on older hardware, right now, Bank shutting down does not eliminate all trading between 3DS games themselves. There are some games that are directly compatible, they can trade locally, but moving Pokemon between certain 3DS generations, like say, maybe from Omega Ruby to Ultra Moon, that even required Bank. So it's not even just breaking a transfer chain of 3DS to Switch, it's actually hurting the 3DS generations of Pokemon just on their own. I'm going to show you some of the transfer chains that exist, but I don't want to get into every individual mechanic because it would just make this video an hour long, and you probably do not need to see that. But regardless, you can do things like take Pokemon from the Game Boy Advance era, move them to the DS, that's easy without Bank. Then you can get them from the DS era into the next part of the DS era, from like Soul Silver to White, Black 2, things like that. After that, you need Transporter. We're talking about official tools here. I will talk about fan replacements later. And even after that, you have to have Transporter, get that into Pokemon Bank, and then get that into Pokemon Home, and then you have compatible modern games. So that's cool. That's cool that those features were officially supported by Nintendo. However, after Bank closes, you can move Pokemon officially from the Game Boy Advance to the DS era, further into the DS era, and then you hit a dead end. You're not going to lose your old local transfer abilities like from GBA to DS, but once you get from DS to 3DS, you needed these tools. It's not just Bank, it's also Transporter, because that was moving things into Bank for the 3DS to be able to read. That's why this was a problem even back then when we were starting to rely on these online tools. And it's not just Game Boy Advance Pokemon. There were games released later on that essentially, they were things like the ports of the originals, like Blue, Red, Yellow. There were ports as well of the Game Boy Color versions, things like Silver, Crystal, Gold. This is interrupting that flow of these games because the 3DS Virtual Console relied on Transporter to move to Bank. So really, this is not just one random generation of Pokemon losing compatibility, this is the entire thing. This is like if you have to get from point A to point B, you're not getting most of the way across the bridge here. Somebody split the bridge down the middle, and you're just stuck with a big gap there. So Jay, why do you care? Why does this matter to you? Well, here's why it matters to me. I care a lot about game preservation. I do care about official tools, and I love that fans create tools to sometimes replace these things. But the thing is, there's a lot of problems with that too. People who collected these games over time, who still own them, they still work, people like me, the Pokemon on those cartridges are still there. So why should owning the original game and the original Pokemon no longer be enough for me to be able to move them? It's not an argument against emulation. You know, I am all for, personally, just my personal opinion, I'm not encouraging you, but I am all for the existence of emulation and all that stuff because I think that these games can no longer officially be purchased from the distributor and the creators, and now they are just being price gouged on eBay. I get it, but people who did own them or who picked them up at a garage sale or secondhand or they collect that original hardware, why are they now locked out of this chain? You know, Nintendo no longer sells these games. Emulation and fan preservation are extremely important, but why is it that the people who do own the original games now are just stuck? You know, I could have a Pokemon sitting on my original Fire Red cartridge that I caught when I was a little kid. That cartridge still works, my save still works, my Pokemon still exists, but if I don't move it before this deadline, that's just it. This is FOMO, and it's FOMO that it's affecting games all the way back in the GBA and DS era, now in 2026. Like, what are we doing here? I don't want to harp on this point very long, but it did used to be different. With, you know, the GBA and the DS, you could just migrate your Pokemon right there without server tools. You had things like the Game Boy Advance eras between each other, you know, after you went and you got the Sevi Islands and the National Decks and all that stuff, you could transfer with a link cable. You could also bring them up from the Game Boy Advance to the DS. You just put the Game Boy Advance game in the GBA slot, the DS game in the DS slot. You're far enough in the game to have that, I believe it was called the Poke Park essentially, unlocked, and then you could just go and catch them, similar to a Safari Zone. But now, we're at this point where we were depending on servers and official tools, and I've been saying for years we knew somebody could eventually turn that server off, and for some reason, every time I say this about something, people think it either doesn't matter or they think it'll never happen, and it always happens. It always happens eventually. But Jay, fan tools exist. I agree. Unofficial tools exist, fans have made ways to back up Pokemon saves, preserve a lot of Pokemon data. That's good, but it does not mean that nothing is being lost here. Fan tools unfortunately do not preserve Pokémon Bank as an official functioning service. They also now require a level of technical knowledge that some people are just not capable of or shouldn't be reasonably expected to have to dig into. We never should have hit the point where we required this connection. That's my point here too. This is also accessibility. Kids, maybe young teenagers, people who don't have the time and the technical know-how, they are not going to get into these things. My personal understanding of it is that when you introduce a Pokemon to home, it is also assigned numbers server side that essentially identify where it's from as well, and the destination that it sees as official coming from these old games is Bank. I don't know what happens when you start putting Pokemon into home that don't have those server-side identifications, and when I was looking into it, there weren't good ways to replicate those, because they're not even metadata that's super visible by the person doing it. They are on a server-side thing with Pokemon Home. This is why I don't like all of this always online mumbo-jumbo, because we hit a point where you are having to bend over backwards and jump through hoops to get official functionality that you shouldn't have to. There's a huge accessibility problem with this. You know, somebody discovers these games years from now, a kid maybe finds their old copy of Pokemon Black that their parents had before them. You know, somebody buys Pokemon X on the original hardware, they're interested in this, and they want to transfer a Pokemon. Okay, there was an easy way to do that before. Now there isn't. Now you need to have modified hardware. You need to have unofficial software. You need to have save extraction tools. You need to actually be knowledgeable about what you're doing. I know some people think, well, the Nintendo re-releases are solving this. Look at this. We have Pokemon XD, we have Fire Red, Leaf Green. They're bringing these games up, Jay. It don't matter. They're all going to be on home. Okay, even if that was true, We still have all those people sitting with their original copies that they should be allowed to do this with, but it also isn't true. Like, Fire Red and Leaf Green launched without home compatibility, and no one was entirely sure if it would get it. Now it's getting it. That's great. But that doesn't preserve those original Pokemon sitting in that original cartridge, and Nintendo's approach is inconsistent. Pokemon XD and some of those games on the Nintendo Switch Online service, for example, don't have any Pokemon Home compatibility, and we don't know if they ever will or not. This is now up to the whims of Nintendo. We hit a point where we used to have control over this stuff, and now it's all on them. It also kind of goes into my theory of them not wanting old Pokemon games to compete with new Pokemon games unless they can find a way to make a ton of money off of them. You know, it doesn't actually financially benefit them for me to boot up my DS anymore. That's something I've been noticing for a while too, is when there's not that financial incentive anymore, a lot of these official tools seem to just fade away. I also now don't trust online access as preservation. I mean, I haven't for a long time, but especially with Nintendo. Up until this point, people could argue that Nintendo did a good job with it. I'm not saying that necessarily the Nintendo Switch Online services will shut down, you'll lose access to everything, whatever. I'm not the boogeyman here. We don't know what will happen though. Let's say the Nintendo Switch 1 Online in the future is shut down. They don't really sell most of those games anymore as eShop games. Now they're all, I have to go on NSO, I have to have their premium membership, then I can play Game Boy Advance games. Okay, what happens when that's gone? Because when that was introduced, people said it didn't matter, it'll just always be there. Well, Pokemon Bank itself is now an example of that not being the case. Nintendo Switch gives you access to many games, but access to anything through an online service is not permanent preservation. There's just no reason to think it'll be that. Think about the original physical games. If an old GameCube game stops working, it can potentially be repaired or replaced, or you can dump those files. I am able to very easily dump files from PS2 games that I have physical copies of onto my computer and then run them through an emulator. That is called legal backups. That's something you can do easily. There's other ways to back up games. I'm not even talking about them. I just mean even with a physical disc that's failing, you can still dump those files. And those files, they work. Now, if Nintendo shuts down an online service, it's not as simple as repairing a GameCube. You can't just repair their server. It's gone. Now, you maybe can replace it with fan tools. Again, that's great. It's not the same thing, and why should that be on us? Why should that be on the technically knowledgeable members of the Pokemon community to step in to do what Nintendo had a responsibility to do? Look, I get servers cost money. Do I have a lot of sympathy for Nintendo, Sony, any of these companies that are cutting costs while making billions? To be honest, not really, no. But I understand that there is a business aspect here, and I understand that eventually they retire old infrastructure because it's a red number on a paper. It's not making money. But the solution doesn't have to be between keep Pokemon Bank running for 500 years or get rid of it entirely. My question is just, why don't you develop a replacement? Develop actual local tools that can do these things officially. But they don't do that. It's just old legacy hardware, so it's abandoned. Why is there no legacy migration utility? Why is there no feature being built into Pokemon Home to account for this? You know, why isn't there more home support in these older games like XD right now? You tell me. I think it's because it's not really necessarily profitable, and they know they don't have to do that. And I understand that if an old Final Fantasy game gets re-released, or maybe an old Fire Emblem, nobody's like, oh, well, I expect my characters and my save to transfer over. No one's expecting that. I get that. But for decades, Pokemon has encouraged people to do this. It's encouraged people to catch Pokemon, raise them, trade them, transfer them to new games, bring them with you in your next adventure. You know, there are people who genuinely have Pokemon they've kept for decades. I have a friend who I believe still has his original starting Pokemon, his original Mudkip, which is now obviously a Swampert, from all the way back on the very first Pokemon game he played, which was Pokemon Sapphire. Why should he not be able to move that around? If you've ever seen one of those games where you play building a wooden tower out of pieces and people try to take a little part out of the middle over and over until it falls, that's kind of what's happening here. Somebody's just knocking the tower down right in the middle. There's still going to be the first few floors, there's still going to be the ability to transfer between a few generations, but officially that's where it stops. You have until February 25th of 2027 to transfer these, and that's it. Then it's game over. Unless Pokemon announces another solution, that official bridge is gone, and games aren't simply preserved because they're temporarily available on some online service. I'm showing you that. You know, Pokemon isn't fully preserved just because maybe they bring a game to the Nintendo Switch and sell it to you again, or they put it on, you know, some kind of online service. That's not the same thing. Part of Pokemon's history and its significance is actually the ability to move your Pokemon you care about through different generations, and that is being officially hurt very badly by this move. If Pokemon wants players to keep forming these lifelong attachments and connections to their Pokemon and caring about them and caring about catching them, then there should be a way to actually bring those with you on your life as you move to newer games. If you enjoyed this video, you want to leave a like, subscribe, I appreciate that so much. This is the Magical Jill channel, obviously, but I did a collaboration with JRPG, so we are doing a lot of RPG focused stuff over there. If you want to check that out, I always appreciate it, and we played through a lot of games on Degenerate Plays, which is our podcast style Let's Play channel, in the description. This stuff is going to be in the link tree as well. And if you want to support this channel, you can do things like using our Fortnite code, commenting, letting me know your thoughts, and even supporting us on Jill's own store, CosmoBunny.shop, which is a fantastic store where we make coasters, keychains, trays, all out of recycled materials like comics, manga, magazines, and art books that have been damaged, using resin to turn those into a transformative coaster, keychain, tray, or more for your home, and you can use code SAILOR for 10% off your first purchase over there. Have a fantastic day, and as always everyone, we will see you in the next one. Bye!